Hi. So my name is Professor Bill Buchanan, and I host a podcast on the world leaders in cryptography. And so today I'm so happy to host Bart Preneel. Hi, Bart.
Hello, Bill.
So Bart is a professor in the electrical engineering department at KU Leuven in Belgium. He is a co-inventor of the Miyaguchi Preneel scheme, and which converts a block cipher into a hash function. Bart is also one of the co-inventors of the RIPE MD160 hashing method, and which is used in Bitcoin addressing. He is also a co-designer of the stream ciphers MUGI, hopefully I've got that correct, and Trivium, the MAC algorithm Chaskey and MDxMAC, and the authenticated algorithm AEGIS that is used to encrypt data at rest within the Google Cloud. Bart was the president of the International Association of Cryptologic Research from 2008 to 2013, and one of his hobbies is conducting the University of Leuven's Bigband and playing saxophone in a Dixieland. Bart consults for industry and government on cybersecurity and privacy. He founded the mobile authentication startup nextAuth and holds roles in Approach Belgium, Tioga Capital Partners, and Nym Technologies. During the pandemic, he co-designed the DP3T scheme for privacy-friendly contact tracing and managed the Belgian Coronalert app. He actively engages with cybersecurity policy, and he contributes to the ENISA as an advisory group member for the EU. That's a long profile.
It is.
So what does your current role involve, and what does a typical day involve for you?
Well, I have a lot of variety in my work, and I also try to do new things. But of course, as an academic, I spend 20% of my time on administration. I'm heading a large group of about 100 people, and most people are self-managed, but still there's quite some paperwork coming with that. Then I also teach quite some courses, depends of course on the time of the year, but it also takes quite some time. Then I still have some time left for research, typically in collaboration with my PhD students and my postdocs. But then I do also other things, quite some reviewing of research centers of education programs. I also manage the advanced master in cybersecurity, which is also quite time intensive. I love to give talks everywhere. I think I give at least one talk per month, and sometimes that involves traveling. I'm also involved with the Belgian Data Protection Authority until next April. Then my involvement may change, but there I give technical advice and I review legislation with respect to compliance with GDPR. And then in my free time, I'm still working on a book on cryptography.
That's because I know that you've written for the Encyclopedia book just now. You've written. Is that the book that you're working on, or is this a separate project?
No, I'm actually working on a textbook. So there is actually,
excellent.
in my view, a gap in the market of textbooks that are oriented towards practitioners. So not too mathematical or too theoretical. There's lots of very good, outstanding books for researchers, but they're typically very thick and very extensive. There is also some very good introductory, not too technical books, but we're looking at something in the middle, which is usable as a course, for example, for engineering students who are not really experts in mathematics, but who want to really understand cryptography at a solid level without actually diving into long proofs or deep theory.
Yeah, I agree. I actually had a query from a student today who was a bit worried about the mathematics that was involved in our MSc module. And I said, really, we were abstracting methods. We weren't going into formal proofs and so on. So I think it can scare some students these days. And it's not that difficult if you just want to explain the concepts of discrete logs or elliptic curves or something like that without getting in deeply into the mathematics. So what were your school days like, your time as a child at school?
Well, I remember I was always bored because things went too slow for me. I had to study languages. I was more or less informed. So I studied Latin and Greek. Plus in Belgium, you get another 3 languages. So I was studying 6 languages. I must say I enjoyed that. I read a lot of books, but I was still trying to spend my free time on studying mathematics, because actually I knew I wanted to become an engineer, study engineering, and work on science, but I was kind of forced to focus on languages. And so, but most of the time, I think I was also in the classroom, at least I was very bored because things went very slowly and I didn't feel I learned as much as I should.
Yeah. And what sparked your interest in maths, cryptography?
Well, for math, I don't know, it's just something that I find it always interesting and intriguing, and I find it also a very valuable concept, things you could solve problems with. Cryptography was very different because I studied in the 80s and then there was no university having cryptography in their program. We just got one lecture on it and I did not find it particularly interesting. I did my master thesis on echo cancellation, so algorithm design, signal processing for modems. That was the hot problem at the time, to get to 32 kilobit speeds on a telephone line. And so I worked with a company simulating the whole modem before it was actually implemented, kind of the first digital twin in the 80s. Of course, that was very tricky at that time to do that with the computational power and systems available at the time. And then I decided I wanted to do a PhD in medical image processing. So I came to my professor and I said, that's what I want to do. And he said, that's great, but you will work on cryptography. So more or less, Professor Van der Walle decided this for me. And this was based on the fact that they had started cryptography very early on in 1978 in our university, after reading the paper by Diffie and Hellman and seeing this was an exciting field. They had recruited their first PhD students, but the student then graduated and left for the US. You were just met. They had also had 5 or 6 researchers, but they created a startup company. And so more or less when I arrived in 1987, nobody was left, more or less. And so they wanted to kickstart this field again. They thought it was high potential. And so the first victim that showed up actually was told to work on this topic, and I think I never regretted the choice.
And so one of the co-inventors of AES also comes from KU Leuven. What makes that university such a great place for crypto research?
Well, one of the things is that they started very early in 1978. Second thing is that they actually have an E department, not a CS department. But of course, if you go back in the times, in the 80s, cryptography was not done in software. It was actually done in hardware. And our university still has the French approach to engineering, which means you first give in the first years basic science, a lot of mathematics, but also physics, chemistry, and then afterwards you specialize, which means that engineers in Leuven have a very good mathematical background, but also an understanding of systems and hardware. And so when we were doing work on cryptography, that was not to create great theories, but actually to try to build a real system. That was more or less the culture. I think there was a very nice combination of this, on the one hand, willing to solve real problems, on the other hand, having the right technical background to do this. Another element, I think, is that there was quite some freedom left. So both Johan and Vincent were working here, but nobody asked us every year to produce reports on what we had achieved or make plans. There was lots of freedom to do research and not this kind of idea of a PhD as a production process. So that meant that people like Vincent and Johan could just think about and play with things. And so they actually worked on this topic since very early on for several years. And so when the time for the advanced encryption standard came, when the call came out, they already had been working for 5 years. And then all the other teams like IBM and Deutsche Telekom, they scrambled together some expert quickly and they tried to do something in a year, but it's very difficult to catch up with 10 people in a year, what 2 people or 3 people have been doing over a period of 6 or 7 years.
That's amazing. And what is it about the Belgium approach to science that makes it such a hotbed? You would think that public key encryption is mainly US, but certainly the hotbed of symmetric key hashing methods and so on tends to be in Europe, around Belgium and those types of countries. What is it about the education infrastructure that brings on so much great research in this area?
As I said, I think we have the French model, so I think also France has a very good culture. On the other hand, of course, Belgium is a bit more independent, and I think that brings us more or less to a future topic. We can discuss the crypto wars. So I think in the 70s and 80s, there was this view that cryptography should be left to governments. That's not something academics should work on. And I think that even exists today in the US. In the US, if you want to work on practical cryptographic design or cryptanalysis, and you go to the NSF, you probably will be told to go to the NSA. And the NSA will happily fund your work, but say you can't publish it. Of course, that means for an academic, more or less, that blocks your career. Maybe you can do exciting work, but if you can't publish, that's not so nice for your career. And that limits your options for the future if you haven't published for a long time. And so I think in Europe, there was also a bit of this control, and we got somehow caught up in it. But on the other hand, in Belgium, there was still this there was no powerful state. Belgium is slightly anarchistic. And so it was felt like let universities do what they want to do. And I think that definitely helped. Also, the department here is very dynamic, has a very strong culture, and started early with research. So the professors I got taught were actually all had PhDs with MIT and Stanford, or at least many of them. And they came back and they created IMEC, which is a microelectronics lab. It was created in the 80s and now has 5,000 people. All came out of our department.
Wow.
So it's a very expansive department. We're doing new things, creating exciting things, having impact was part of the culture and was also strongly encouraged.
So you can really trace your roots back to the mid-1970s. I think the Diffie-Hellman paper was 1976, RSA was 77. So did some Belgian researchers work at MIT and Stanford when these things were happening and they came back?
Well, not really. I think it also is before my time, and also the people who did their work in MIT and Stanford were working in hardware. So this was the focus of this department was microelectronics. But I think there was a culture in the department to pay attention to what was happening in the US. And this is why the people here actually read the Diffie-Hellman paper and found it cool and decided that they should start working on cryptography. So I think that was one of the factors. The other factor, which also affects Belgium, was Philips. So Philips had a very large research lab, NetLab, also had a division in Belgium. And many people don't know this, but Philips is one of the companies that for a while made more money from patents than any other company. So they had a very strong research culture. For example, one of the big successes of the 80s was the CD that was together with Sony, but Philips was a key player in there. And so Philips was working on smart cards and also on cryptography. And so they also had very good researchers working on this topic also in Belgium. And there was also some cross-fertilization between those two groups, our group and the Philips group.
Yeah, that's excellent. And so can you outline what the International Association of Cryptologic Research is and what was involved in your role of president?
So the IACR is a not-for-profit organization created in the early 80s. So in the 70s, when the paper by Diffie-Hellman and Westermeer Edelman was published, these things were published in computer science venues or IEEE venues. So there was computer science or electrical engineering. There was no separate society dealing with this. And then it was decided to organize the first conferences, crypto in the US, and then a bit later, Eurocrypt in Europe. And it was felt that the structural organization should be created to manage those conferences. And I guess the bigger organizations like IEEE and ACM probably didn't want to touch this subject. That was one of the reasons why they didn't do this. And I think it's a great society. It's relatively small, I think even now compared to the big ones. ICR is about 3,000 members. It's a great society because it's all volunteer run. And so the first thing we did was run the conferences, but then the services increased, workshops were added, we had our own journal, and now we are self-publishing, we went into self-publishing. There is also more applied symposia where industry gets a spot. So in general, it's a very dynamic organization. And the great thing about it, it's all volunteer run, which means that actually in terms of value for money, ICR offers great services because it's a society run by researchers for researchers. And if you look at the registration fees in conferences by IEEE or ACM compared to ICR, what you get in value for money is much better because we don't have any staff. On the other hand, of course, it means that ICR runs a number of volunteers that spend a lot of their time to run the organization. And to give you an idea, the turnover of ICR is several $1 million per year. We organize 7 or 8 events per year, and the biggest ones have 600 or 700 people. So it's definitely a very large effort, and it's really a privilege to be able to serve as president of this, because then you can help the community, but you can also rely on a set of volunteers who generously donate their time and run the organization. I think it's a great benefit to the community that we do this, Also, very important for us is to make all our science available for free to everybody. This is more or less our goal. Some publication contracts limit this, but in general, we've been able to do this. And so one of the big benefits of the efforts of IACR is that anybody has access to our content, and that includes not only papers, but also slides and videos. And so even if you're a researcher in a remote place today, you can actually follow up everything without having to pay any fee to an organization. You can just follow what's happening. You can see the invited talks of great people, all on our services.
Yeah, that's great. I think in the UK just now there is some dispute between academia and the IEEE for accessing research papers. And I think academia think that the cost is too high now. So you're right. I think that open access is a great thing to implement.
It's a great feature, but of course not at the cost of extreme costs. I mean, the problem, of course, of IEEE is it's a very well-run organization, but it has also a very large number of staff members, and they all have to be paid. They used to be paid from charging costs on physical print and production costs, so they could have an overhead with this, but now that everything is online, in fact, they have to get their money from charging for content or charging for conferences. And indeed, in the end, it becomes very expensive, in particular because it's the scientists to do the work, the scientists to do the reviewing. And so the added value of these organizations seems to be less now, because the distribution of content, which was their main goal, now actually anybody can do this. So ICR recently has started our own journal, is self-publishing. And our estimate is that apart from volunteer time, the real cost to publish a paper is about $5. What it costs to register DOI and manage the IT systems, to pay for the storage and so on. That's about $5. While of course commercial publishers charge between $500 and $5,000 to publish a paper.
Yeah. And what's the peer review like for that type of? Is it a lightweight like archive, a lightweight peer review, or do you have unpaid reviewers for it?
Well, ICR is a self-run organization. That means that the publication model has gone to everything. We have everything you can imagine. So we have still conferences published with Springer Verlag, but also we have published conferences, hybrid journal conference hybrids, where you actually publish at a conference, present at a conference, but publish in a journal. And this is run by University of Bochum. In general, for those venues, they're highly competitive. So typical acceptance rate is 20 to 25%. You get very critical reviews, very long reviews sometimes. And so definitely it's very high quality reviewing, and the very best people review there. We also have Journal of Cryptology, which is for archival, publishes lower volumes, but then there's also Communications in Cryptology. This is a newer mechanism where it tends to be slightly less competitive, but this is self-published. And then we also have the ePrint service, where there is no peer review. There is more or less a check that it's like archive. There is a check that the content is not insulting anybody, that it's actually scientific content relevant to the IACR. And if you satisfy those minimum criteria, we'll publish the ePrint. But that's not a publication. But all the other venues of IACR do have peer review, and for some it can be very tough.
Yeah, that's good. So you've researched into many areas of cryptography. I think that includes hashing methods, privacy-aware methods, symmetric key ciphers, and cryptanalysis. What do you think is your favorite area to work in?
My take to research is that I want to change topic every 3 to 5 years. So I don't want to stay with the same topic, although sometimes I still have topics I come back to, or I still have a student working on this. But I think I've liked everything I did so far, and I also liked the variety and the change. Of course, I did my PhD thesis on hash functions, and I think that's still a very interesting topic, because it's a very specific area of cryptography where there is no secrets, no keys, and that makes it actually very hard to design hash functions. And it turns out that also that means our intuition is kind of off. So when you ask an expert to make a hash function, then they actually don't make it secure enough, they don't make the function complex enough. And so the trade-offs we tend to choose tend to be very bad, which has given rise to the hash function crisis in 2004, MD4, MD5, but also SHA-0 and SHA-1 designed by the NSA were shown to be much less secure than actually believed. I think now the designs that we have today are much more robust and seem to have enough margin. It's still an interesting topic to keep studying whether we can make better architectures there and better solutions. but I don't think we'll face soon such a crisis again. It was very remarkable. It was a crisis to be foreseen because already 10 years before, researchers had said these functions are not secure enough, you shouldn't rely on them, but more or less industry ignored the advice. Also in the 90s, performance was a big issue. So today cryptography is very cheap, but in the 90s cryptography was a bottleneck and slowed down your system. So academic researchers warning like this function is too fast, it will not be secure, you should make it twice slower. They were not very popular in industry, and industry was happy to ignore them. Until, of course, the crisis came, and then they had to deal with this.
That's right, yeah. And obviously we're trying to migrate away from SHA-1 with its 160-bit hash. Obviously the size of the hash was weak when it was created. And SHA-256 also has problems now.
Well, I think when SHA-1 was created, this is 93, 94, it was actually fine. I mean, 160-bit result is even today still enough for pre-image resistance, for not being able to invert a function or finding a second pre-image. For collision resistance, of course, it became not strong enough, I would say, about 10 to 15 years ago. With SHA-2, I don't think there is many problems. It's still remarkable. This is a very popular function, although the design criteria have not been made public and there is no justification of the design. And it still has this kind of weakness that if you have a text and you know the hash, and then you add another block, you can compute the extension of the hash without knowing the original text, which is something which is a counterintuitive property we should get rid of. And SHA-3 doesn't have this property, or the hash function based on ASCON. You can avoid this property by using SHA-512/256, so you use a larger function and then you keep only half the result. But it's kind of bizarre that this hash function has a flaw we know about for a long time, but for some reason people still keep using it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think NIST are saying that we should upgrade to 256 AES and also to SHA-256. I even heard that the Australian authorities were going to deprecate SHA-256. I don't know if it was some sort of misguidance, but I think you're right. The SHA-256 seems to be secure at the current time.
Well, I think this Australian guide is a misunderstanding. I think, I guess it's clear that if a large quantum computer can be built, we have a problem with RSA, with Diffie-Hellman over ZP and elliptic curves. There is Grover's algorithm for symmetry, but experts looked at this in detail, and so the claim is that you can do a search in time square root, so you halve the effective security level, and collisions in a third root, so you go for n over 2 to n over 3. But if you start looking in detail at those claims, in fact, they're not substantiated by facts. Indeed, there is an algorithm, but then if you look at the computer needed, the level of parallelism, in fact, these algorithms are not parallelizable or require huge computers. In fact, that they don't seem to be for any reasonable cost measure really faster. And so I think the safe prediction is that for symmetric cryptography, we can for now ignore quantum computers unless you're going to implement your algorithms on a quantum computer, which would be your cryptographic algorithms, which there seems to be no reason to do this, but why would you put sensitive information on such a computer? So this is probably something for the very long term, but there was a very nice invited talk by Sam Jacques at Chess in which he really detailed the arguments and showed that for symmetric key, we actually should not worry about quantum computers. And there is no reason to shift from AES 128 to 256 or from TAF 256 to SHA-512. There is no reason. Of course, if you're doing it as part of your migration, we're not going to stop you, but there is actually other priorities and other things that are more important than this change.
Yeah, which is likely to be elliptic curve and RSA are going to be the main problems. So what was so special about RIPE MD 160?
Well, I think maybe at the time it was not so special, but today it is, because what happened was there was a European project, we can come back to that, the RIPE project, Race Integrity Primitives Evaluation. So there was a research project to run kind of an open competition, and MD4 and MD5 got submitted. And this project found flaws in both of them. I mean, not leading to a serious break. The real serious break only happened in 2004, although Dobertin already found collisions for MD4 in 96, but then Professor Wang found collisions for MD4 by hand in 2004. It was really like a real break. But I think as project, we felt that MD4 and MD5 were not something we could recommend after this project. And so then I think we made kind of a haphazard decision to quickly make a design because we felt like we've been spending taxpayers' money, and our outcome is, well, there is no secure hash function, so well, let's do something we think is more robust, and this is how RIPEMD was designed. With the 128-bit result, because was kind of the goal was to make it plug replacement for MD4 and MD5. And then I think my late friend, Professor Hans Dobbertin, was that time was working at BSI. They got a message from the German and Swiss banks that this was not sufficient for them. They wanted to have a 60-bit result to have security for the next 10 to 15 years. And so then we got together with my colleague Anton Boslaars and myself and Hans. We actually got together and we designed RIPEMD 160, which was kind of an extended version of hash function, which more or less also a competitor of SHA-0, proposed by the US government, by the NSA, and then they changed their proposal after a year, say, we think it's not secure now, but here is SHA-1, you can trust it. And so more or less at the time, there were two designs for 160-bit hash results, SHA-1 and RIPEMD 160. And the whole industry chose SHA-1, but in fact, it turns out we were right. I mean, not the whole industry, because the German government and the Swiss and German banks chose RIPEMD 160, also Bitcoin, by the way. Yeah. But so I think more or less in 2004, we were proven right because Professor Wang showed serious shortcomings in SHA-1, and even to this day, 2024, there is no shortcoming in RIPEMD 160. Of course, the hash result is too short to give collision resistance today, but there is no shortcut collision attack on RIPEMD 160, and there is no inversion attack. So in some sense, it's something I'm very proud of because it shows actually that 30 years ago, our intuition was better. I mean, the US ecosystem and the big companies ignored us, but it kind of gives some satisfaction to know 30 years later that like, you had a better design that actually stood the test of time, while the NSA, who actually in a meeting where I was present, they called Professor Ron Rivest, the Turing Award winner, who designed MD4 and MD5, they called him an amateur. So they saw themselves as the professionals, and they said, we can't standardize the work of an amateur. And it gives some satisfaction that, in fact, now it turns out that also the NSA were amateurs. And that it seems that Hans Dobbertin and Anton and myself, we were probably the experts at the time because it seems we had the better design.
Yeah. And do you know why Satoshi Nakamoto selected RIPEMD 160 for Bitcoin?
Well, it's not so surprising in the sense that this must have been done 2008, 2009. So at that time, it was clear that SHA-1 was broken. And RIPEMD 160 actually, he named it only 160-bit result because he doesn't need collision resistance. So that was kind of a natural design because it was the only hash function at the time. If you were looking for a 160-bit result that actually was robust, at that time it had proven its security for 15 years and there were no real breakthroughs in cryptanalysis. So it's kind of a natural choice. The strange thing is more that he was aware of this design because in the US, people actually switched from SHA-1 to SHA-2 and there was very little attention for RIPEMD 160. But I think it did the job for him. And I mean, there was no reason to use SHA-2 in some way to get 160-bit result if there was a good design that would actually achieve what he needed.
Yeah. And obviously there's been a great advancement in hashing methods recently with SHA-3 being advanced with the sponge function. So do you think there are still research gaps in the usage of hashing methods?
I still think that design of hashing methods, I mean, from an engineering point of view, we have now very good solutions, but there are still very fundamental problems. I mean, we don't have a deep understanding which functions are one way and why. There is no way we can prove much beyond, if I make some assumptions about the building blocks, then the rest is good, but justification of the building blocks. So at least from a theory perspective, these point functions are very hard to deal with. So more or less, you have to assume the permutation is ideal and random. But in fact, in the real design, you use a fixed permutation, which is highly structured and is really not random because it has been designed by some clever people who made a very specific structure. So there is definitely some deep theory gaps that we can't prove much in this. And so in that sense, I think hash functions are related to more or less very hard problems in complexity theory. There is also some implementation gaps. So it's clear that if you offer hardware implementations, SHA-3 is much faster than SHA-2. But for now, I mean, the SHA-3 standard was published in 2012. The industry has decided to speed up SHA-2. So in fact, the response of Intel and AMD and ARM has to be to make their processors be faster at implementing SHA-2 rather than adding hardware for SHA-3. There is something to be said for this because SHA-3 has this 1600-bit state. It's not even a power of 2. If you're used to deal with 128 bits, 256-bit, 512 bits, then this 1600 bits is really very painful to deal with. It requires really a special instruction. You can't share any registers you have for multimedia or for other things. So you really have to add a dedicated component, which is annoying. And in that sense, maybe ASCON, the lightweight version, which was recently selected by NIST Lightweight competition, has a 322-bit state, 320-bit state, which actually is still not a power of 2, but at least it may be much easier to squeeze this somewhere in a 512-bit register and then leave some bits unused. But I think that was one of the reasons why SHA-3 was not as widely adopted, was that in fact there was no big advantage in software, and then the hardware was kind of too incompatible with our current processors. Now this will likely change because it turns out that for many post-quantum algorithms, you need a very fast hash function. It turns out that in several candidates, the hash function is the bottleneck, whether it's SHA-2 or SHA-3. And so then if hashing is a bottleneck in your construction, it may become an advantage to make hardware. And in that case, of course, natural choice will be to implement SHA-3. And so what I predict, but of course there is still no official plans as far as I know, is that the processor companies will add in the next years a SHA-3 instruction, and then hashing will become blazingly fast. So we have this kind of change all the time. We first used DES, then MD hashing were faster, MD5 was faster, and SHA-1 were faster. Then with AES encryption way faster. It may well be that actually once these sponges are implemented in hardware, that actually hashing and sponges will become faster than block ciphers again. So this is typically a trend in cryptography. That you see that one design or the other becomes faster over time, and then once you get hardware support, the battle is actually settled. But it may mean we're going to use more sponges in the next decade, at least if those hardware instructions will be available and the real hardware is added.
Yeah, because I see that some of the post-quantum signature standards are looking at pre-hashing, which is that you've got to actually create your hash before you actually feed it into the signature method. Because these efficient small hashing methods are much better than the normal ones. So you've researched into block ciphers, and I think you proposed the conversion of a block cipher into hashing method, which can be done through sponge methods these days. But you've also worked on stream ciphers, efficient ones, and one of those was the Trivium cipher. What was it about Trivium that makes it useful?
Trivium, and the main credit should go to Christophe de Cagnière, who was the main designer, is a stream cipher that kind of challenges all conventions. I mean, stream ciphers were typically designed by using linear feedback shift registers, which are linear, and then find some clever way to combine them in a nonlinear way. Add some nonlinear function in the output or in the combination, or have some extra state, which is, for example, what Node 3G does, and process this in a different algebra. So Trivium uses a nonlinear feedback mechanism, which is traditionally known as very hard to study. So this concept was known, but it was not very hard to study. And Trivium is a very simple structure with only a handful of XOR and AND gates. So it's really a very simple and elegant design. It was designed for the eStream competition. So between 2004 and 2012, I was running a European project called eCrypt that brought together many hundred of researchers in Europe. And in the beginning of eCrypt, we had the eStream competition, a stream cipher competition, because we felt that this was an interesting challenge to design more lightweight ciphers, even more lightweight than AES. And so Trivium kind of pushed the limit. So it uses a very compact state of a bit less than 600 bits, but then very few logical gates, just a few XOR gates and a few AND gates. And it was more like a challenge. Look what we can build, and we see no way how to attack it. And I guess the shortcoming of Trivium was that we only designed it for an 80-bit key, which was actually the requirement of the eStream competition. Again, 20 years ago, this was seen to be enough. Today, of course, it's not. But somehow we felt that, at least if we would have to gamble, we would have said somebody's going to find a new attack and we'll have a better understanding how to design nonlinear feedback shift registers. It turns out, in fact, that after 20 years, nobody has found an attack. And we have no way how to break this. There's been quite some efforts to break Trivium, and all the efforts have focused on the key setup. And there they got to break between 800 steps of the setup, but the real setup is more than 1,000 steps, so it's not that they even got close. And anyway, you could, if that would be the weakness, you could just increase the setup to 1,400 steps and stop the attack. So, but nobody managed to actually attack the main core of the algorithm. So I think we've discovered an interesting new principle of stream cipher design, and I'm very curious whether there is attacks on it or not. In the meantime, people actually have been using this cipher because it actually gives you very high speed because you can parallelize. Although if you look at it, it doesn't look like parallel, but it can really make parallel. And because it has a very low nonlinear depth, so the number of successive AND gates is very low, it's very suitable for multi-party computation or computing on encrypted data in general. And so some researchers have made Trivium, a variant of Trivium, which has a 128-bit key. So it's kind of an extension using the same principles, extending it. And this has been used by some companies for multi-party computation solutions. So it's definitely an interesting cipher. It was more put forward as a challenge, but after 20 years, it turns out that actually it seems to be a solid design, or at least I try to convince researchers to work on this because maybe there is a flaw in there, but at least nobody has found it so far.
Yeah, so NIST ran a competition for lightweight ciphers, and Trivium was one of the finalists, and I think was one of the best. But Argon won in the end. Argon didn't seem to excel in any area. It was probably one of these things that it just did okay in most areas and managed to get a good score. So how do you think Trivium fared against the others in the competition? Well,
just to correct you there, so Trivium was submitted in the eStream competition and then got kind of a winner there. But then when the lightweight competition happened, I mean, I was trying to find a team to extend Trivium to 128 bits because this required 128 bits, but at that time I couldn't find this. And Christoph had moved to Google, and I think he was still doing some cryptographic work, but definitely not the design of stream ciphers. It's not part of his job at Google. So he kind of lost interest in the project. So we couldn't find a good team, and I had some other colleagues and other students, but they were working on their own designs rather than adopting somebody else's design. So Trivium actually was never submitted because we didn't find a team to put behind it and make a 128-bit version. But so the winner, Ascon, is more or less an optimization, a further evolvement of Ketchak, which is the SHA-3 core. So it was a sponge, which makes it very nice because it's kind of the scheme of the times. And the nice thing of a sponge is it can do hashing, it can do stream cipher, it can do MAC, it can do authenticated encryption. So it's kind of a very flexible tool. And it's simpler than a block cipher because it just has a permutation. So it's a nice development. And so Ascon managed to take the principles of Ketchak, but then go from a 1600-bit state to a 320-bit state. Now, Ketchak also has smaller versions, which nobody seems to have studied in detail or used a lot. But so by making a more compact permutation, Ascon is more lightweight. And then, of course, you have a bit of Swiss Army knife. Once you have the Ascon design, you actually now have all the solutions. So NIST has now published the document. This is only about a year ago, the winner and the specification. There may be some pickup. It remains to be seen whether, for example, some people will include it in their product. So I think the big question is also, will somebody develop hardware for it and make a hardware instruction? Because probably if it has to remain in software, it's not going to be much faster than its competitors. But if it can be done in software, it would be in hardware instruction, I think it would be a very nice tool to have. Especially if small embedded processors would implement an Ascon permutation, that would make a very nice tool to reduce the cost of encryption on those processors.
Yeah. Okay. And you published a paper on towards measuring anonymity. What were your main conclusions in that paper?
Well, it's interesting to see that. I mean, cryptography was very much engineering and ad hoc, and then there was a big research effort in the 80s to produce foundations of cryptography. So all the theory work, trying to build a theoretical framework where we formally define what secure encryption is, what secure signatures are, and so on. This is a great line of research that was started mostly in institutions like Weizmann and in MIT, and it actually was highly influential. It turns out that actually in privacy there was no such formal way of modeling things. And so the ideas of privacy were first put forward by David Chaum, who proposed many innovative designs. But one of the things we looked at is that So in the late 90s, people started proposing several designs for privacy for the web, onion routing, and some other schemes. And the question we were looking at is, how can you actually compare two systems? Is there a way to measure this? And in cryptography, you can do this with the key sizes, and you have a formal model where you have to define also what security is. And in privacy, this was all missing. And it turns out that actually in that year, there were two papers submitted to the privacy conference, PETS, and they both proposed to use information theory to measure information about who sent a certain message in an anonymity system. And so this is, I think, in some sense, a very influential paper, because we showed that actually also in privacy, you can have quantitative metrics where you can measure security of a system, and you can also compare two systems. And so it was interesting that two independent teams actually proposed this at the same conference. And I think since then, it's one of the standard ways to actually study anonymity systems. Of course, there have been many more. And I think this was only the first one of a series of quantitative measures. But definitely, I think in that sense, it was quite an influential paper.
Great. And you also wrote a paper on the encryption debate, and that focuses on the crypt wars, which have been around for many decades, and of course so many problems actually because of the possible backdoors that law enforcement would put into our systems, and also the reducing of the security levels of that. So what are your main conclusions that you've found within that paper? Where are we with the crypto wars?
Well, I think my prediction is that these wars will go on. It's kind of never ending. I mean, the first phase of the war was actually in the 70s and 80s, when governments tried to suppress research and stop people from publishing. For example, we had the RAI project, which I was not co-submitted, but there was a project submitted by Professor Van der Walle, my supervisor, together with David Schaum and some other researchers, and we want to do evaluation of cryptographic algorithms. So ask people to send their algorithms and then make a recommendation, a competition. And then this project was stopped by the secret services of the big countries in Europe. And this project was a long negotiation, a fight at political level between academics and governments and the commission. And the compromise was that we could not work on encryption, but only on authentication or integrity. And this explains the name RIPE. RACE was the EU program for communication, secure communications. It was RACE integrity primitives evaluation. So no confidentiality primitives evaluation. So that was also in Europe, there was a fight. And for a while then actually these four countries installed a regime in which any project in cryptography that was submitted to the European Commission was killed. And I know because I was at the table. I was sent by Belgium to go there, and of course I found out that the decisions had been taken the day before by those four countries. You can imagine who they were. So Germany, France, Netherlands, and UK. They actually killed all the research projects submitted on cryptography. This was in the 90s. This is also why in 99 I submitted a new project called Nessie, because I thought it was a project I would never see. But strange enough, Nessie, the climate had changed in 99, and Nessie was approved and was a new competition which I ran and organized in 99 together with 6 other partners. The second crypto war was about access to communication, and this was I was actually living in the US in Berkeley as postdoc, and so this was the big debate on the Clipper chip, where the governments wanted key escrow and a backdoor in the system rather than commercial systems. And then that was about this case. Then the next crypto war, or the big high-profile event, was the San Bernardino attack, where the FBI asked Apple to get access to a confiscated iPhone of a terrorist. So in the first crypto war, the enemies were the academics. In the second crypto war, it was more organized crime that would abuse end-to-end encryption. In the third one, the bad guys were terrorists. And we all know how it ended. FBI got access to the phone anyway, through a hack, with no help from Apple, but there was no information on that phone. And then the next crypto war is the one we're still in full middle, is child pornography. So CSAM, child sexual abuse material. So now more or less governments have decided that, yes, we can't stop end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp has it, Signal has it. We want to then scan content before it's being encrypted. So client-side scanning, this is now where regulation is being introduced, and there is a very long debate at European level whether this should happen or not. And I think both UK and Australia also have these fights. It's also very interesting that in this case, the US doesn't do anything because the US has the First Amendment. And these kind of things would not be acceptable there. But apparently they managed to use their power to get these debates going in the US and to enforce it in Europe and to get the debate here. But so more or less, I think the crypto wars are about the fact that cryptography is not about mathematics, it's about power in society, because it's about access to information and who controls what. And I do acknowledge that law enforcement and intelligence services have a problem, although I do think also they have much more information than they ever had. But in spite of that, they still want more information, and they will keep fighting to get this, and they will still keep trying to get access to these things. And it's a big mistake because it's important for human rights, but also for protection of society. There was the very big incident last fall when the US discovered that the APT from China, Cell Typhoon, had penetrated 9 US telecom providers, and they could eavesdrop on calls of lots of high-profile people in the US. Well, if there would have been end-to-end encryption, this kind of attack where you compromise the network nodes will not give you access to communication. So I'm afraid that this debate will keep going, and the debate is very tiring because the government side never comes with hard fact and statistics. It's always intimidation and suggestions and insinuations. But if there is such a problem, you would have to show what the real problem is for law enforcement intelligence services. I do understand that intelligence services cannot show everything they do, but I think from the Snowden documents we know that they have much more powers than we did, and I don't think they've been resting for the last 10 years. I think they've extended their capabilities. I have no doubts about this. But I think in general, with law enforcement, if they don't come with hard facts, there can be no debate. And so more or less what they try to do is to use emotions and influence politicians and say, you will be successful in reducing crime if you give us those powers, but never actually showing the risks of abuse of these technologies. Yeah. And so I'm afraid that for the next decade, we will see this, and I don't think this debate will ever die down, because it's actually a debate about control in society.
Yeah. And the flip side is obviously, if there is a backdoor, then what's to stop an adversary actually getting that backdoor? So you can never win, really.
Exactly, that's the point. And also, even if you would be able to control it, who's going to get it? I mean, How many thousands of police services are in the world, are there, and who are you to decide which police service gets access or not? I mean, so even this is a very practical problem. So even if without being legitimate access, who are you going to get legitimate access? This is already a very hard problem that if you ask them how will they solve this, then there is no answer typically.
Yeah. So I remember working on WEP. I don't know if you remember WEP for wireless, and I think that used RC4 as its stream cipher. In those days, you couldn't really do a block cipher on Wi-Fi, and used RC4. And I think it had a 24-bit initialization vector. So it was eventually cracked because the initialization vector came round again, typically after a day or two, and you could XOR the streams together and discover the plain text. So I think you looked at RC4 and found some vulnerabilities. Can you remember what those vulnerabilities were?
Yeah, I think in general, it's I don't remember the exact equation, but more or less we show statistical flaws in the output stream. So what the goal of a stream cipher is, you give it a short key, and the output should be completely unbiased, and you should not be able to distinguish from a random sequence. Now it turns out that the RC4 sequence had lots of biases, and people kept finding them, and we also found some new ones. I like it when you bring up the web example, because web is interesting, because I always tell my students this is a great example, because all the mistakes you can make in cryptography are made in a single protocol. Because the other mistake, in fact, was that web didn't have an IV. So RC4 didn't have an IV. So I think that was kind of an oversight by Rivest. I think it's still an ingenious design, but it was designed in the late 80s, 87 for Lotus Notes for encryption there. And for some reason, the application there didn't need an IV. I guess every file or every document would have a different key. And of course, that was a big problem in web, because there you had, for every packet, you had to have a different IV. And then they didn't know any better than actually put the IV in the key value, which was then also a very big problem. So I think it's a very useful protocol for technical purposes to show how not to design things.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you also defined a method called privacy-friendly pay-as-you-go insurance in 2007. Can you remember what those methods were that you implemented for that?
Yes, well, these things all came from discussions on privacy. So more or less at that time, the large players started to come up, and there was much more influence. Things of cloud architecture, centralization, everybody using a few technologies. So there was a big concentration in technology. And also the fact that spying became a lot easier. So the one that triggered this research was a newspaper article showing that in one country, I don't remember which one, that there was a big increase in market share of these insurance companies that were putting more or less a spy in your car. And then if you didn't drive in the weekends, you didn't accelerate too much, you didn't misbehave in general, you actually got a discount on your insurance. And they did this by collecting all your data with GPS and centralizing all your data. And so more or less we were kind of shocked about this, and we wanted to show that you could still get the benefit. I mean, there is some legitimate motivation of rewarding good driving behavior. We didn't think this is inherently unethical. I think it's fine, even for insurance. I think it actually makes sense that people who drive more carefully should pay a lower premium. But we show you can actually do this by doing all the processing locally. So more or less you put a module in your car, and that car measures your behavior, and then every month send a signed statement of how many kilometers you've been driving and how good or bad, how many bad points you've acquired, how many good points you've acquired. We actually knew what the response would be. It would be like, you can't do this. So we actually built this. And we had even OpenStreetMap and whatever. It was the limit of what technology could achieve. And I think, but in the end, we actually, in 2008 or 2009, we could actually build this system and demonstrate it worked. So I think in that sense, it was interesting. And we also extended it to road pricing, where you have also the problem that you have to also have checked that people actually do use the thing, because of course you could sabotage the device in your car. And so they had a mechanism for both cases where you would have cameras across the road that would take once in a while pictures, but not everywhere, like we have in London, for example, but only for spot checking. And as a car, you would send commitments to where you had been. But of course, those commitments would not reveal anything. But then if you had been photographed, you would be asked to open the commitment and show that indeed you had the commitment. And this way you could actually check that people are not driving with this box disabled. So, and then people later on made further amendments to this or improvements to this proposal. So I think it's a very interesting project that shows you can do things which seem to be impossible, but with clever cryptography, you can do them. You can build them, but it's just that there is no societal interest in this. I remember we went to the commission to try to push it to them, but the police said, no, we actually want cameras everywhere and we want to be monitoring everybody everywhere because this is how we can catch criminals better. And of course, also big tech, the large companies wanted to put cameras everywhere because there was smart cities could be built like this. And this is more or less what we have today. We have cameras everywhere. Those systems are still not there. We still don't have road pricing because of public sensitivity. But still, we show that you can have societal benefit without violating privacy of users. And that's more or less also similar to what we achieved for contact tracing, so the Coronalert app.
Yeah. And I suppose blockchain and cryptocurrency has been one area that has really advanced itself in terms of privacy-aware cryptocurrency. So the EU has mandated that we have EIDAS2 regulation in the EU, and I think there's going to be a rollout, a mass rollout in 2026. So what's your feelings about that? Because you have EIDAS2 and obviously the associated EID for every citizen and business within the EU. Do you think this is going to be a privacy nightmare, or do you think it's well designed?
Well, it's a very complex process like everything in the EU, but what I have seen so far has made me very worried. Because EIDAS is about more than only the wallet. It's also about what web browsers can do and cannot do, and there we had a big conflict with the Commission. And more or less, in the end, it turns out that the Parliament and the Commission were willing to listen to us, but the Member States just ignored it. And so what we were worried about is that indeed Member States will use this regulation for identity to create a big spying infrastructure. And the wallet, I still don't think it will be rolled out in 2 years, because I think I was at a presentation 3 years ago where they also said it would be in 2 or 3 years, and I told them it's not possible. In general, I have no problem with a wallet, and maybe this is more Belgian than UK. I know in UK this idea of a government identity is a bit against common culture, also the US. But I think in many countries in Europe, this is acceptable, that you have an ID issued by the government, and we have in Belgium electronic ID card, like in Estonia. Every citizen has this, and it's not by itself a particularly problem for privacy. It actually makes some services more efficient. Of course, there could be privacy improvements to this, but by itself, that's not a problem. It's also not a problem that Europe wants to make a single wallet to make services more easily available. I think that would be a positive benefit of Europe, and I've actually worked in 5 European countries, and I can tell you dealing with administration is a nightmare for your health insurance, your pension, for me it was usually not a full-time job, but even then you have to jump to all the hoops, and it just doesn't work. It's on paper you can move anywhere, but in practice it's very difficult. So again, improving this is not a problem. The big problem I see is with private sector. So the goal of this wallet is that it should also be accessible to private sector, which is again fine. I don't have a problem. Anyway, my bank today asks to see my identity card anyway every 2 or 3 years to make sure that I'm still this person, so they have the KYC regulation. But the problem, of course, is that if the government issues an ID and then more or less makes it de facto standard that the whole private sector can use it, then you actually have to have very strong privacy features. And the regulation, as it is written and amended and so on, it doesn't give me very high confidence. So there is big words about privacy, unlinkability, and so on. But then if you look at the fine details, all these things are optional or possible. And also if you look at the documents, because there is also implementation regulation, it's a very complex process. I don't have very high confidence that the solutions that will be rolled out will be strongly privacy protected. And I think as a response, there will be a backlash by academics, by NGOs, saying like, you can't have this, and people will refuse to use the app or the wallet. So I think this actually, they're shooting in their own foot. Having said that, of course, academia is also in part responsible because we never designed a complete system for this. And so what we find out now is that, well, we have a lot of building blocks and there's been 20 years of research to do this, but nobody actually designed a complete system. So you cannot say, oh, implement this. And of course, also the requirements are still coming as the system is being designed. We can't be blamed for that. The other problem that makes it harder is there is a big legacy of phones. You can't tell every citizen to get a new phone in the next 5 years. And there is also the post-quantum problem. So all these things together make it actually quite tricky. I'm also very honest, we don't have a spec of 100 pages and say, if you implement this, then everything is gone. But I think if this is what academics say, the Commission should say, okay, we should take a step back. We should fund academics and experts to work for whatever they need, the time they need, 1, 2, 3 years. Spend a few tens of millions of euros to make those specs and make an example system and then roll it out. What they're going to do now is, while they're drafting the standards and architecture, they're trying to do some hacks and make some changes, and it's a very complex mess. Nobody knows what's happening. And I think there is a very big risk that in the end, it will be a failure. Yeah. That's more or less my concerns, that there is no integrated approach. And by focusing too much on the timeline, if you give up privacy, you can make the timeline, 26 may be possible, but then I think there will be a boycott action against the app.
Yeah, and I think there hasn't been a lot of information about the actual distributed architecture. I think each country will actually look after their own ledger, and there's no information about how these ledgers will actually all link together. So I think you're right, there is a lot of questions to be answered. So around the time of COVID, you did a lot of privacy preserving methods, such as a privacy preserving proximity tracing. And I remember the time that many people were looking at that, using Bluetooth beacons and so on. And I think what you managed to do was to create some sort of standard method for proximity tracing. Can you remember how that worked?
Well, the main credit should go to my old student, Professor Carmela Troncoso, who was at that time professor at EPFL. She got a team together of about 30 academics, so technical experts, but also geologists and legal people. And they also had very good contacts with big tech, because in the end they had to implement things. And more or less, we kind of foresaw that this pandemic would be used to create a gigantic surveillance infrastructure. We were very worried about this. And if you let the doctors free hand, they would want to have register where everybody is all the time, and with the systems that have been rolled out in Korea or in China, where more or less the pandemic is used as an excuse to spy on everybody with this excuse, well, we have to be able to trace infections. And so we had been working on some of those systems before, like today you have the AirTag where you can follow where your devices are, or where your suitcase is, or your bicycle is. So we already had a paper that showed how you could do this without Apple knowing where your AirTag is. So it was actually possible to do this. It never was implemented, but I think there was quite some ideas about this. And so this DP3T team, we actually designed a system where every phone would just send out beacons. And if you collected the beacon, you would register the beacon you collected, and together with the signal strength, so you could make a vague estimate of the distance. And these beacons were all derived from a key, which you would keep on your phone. And then if you had a positive test, you would upload those keys in a database, a public database, so it's not a secret. And all the users of the app would then download those keys, say, a few times a day. From those keys, they could compute the beacons and compare them to the beacons in their phone which they had received, and from this get an indication of their risk, whether it was low or moderate or high. And then the nice thing of this system was that since these keys are not so privacy sensitive because they don't reveal much, nobody knows who a key belongs to, it was actually also possible to design systems in every country, because every country had a different healthcare infrastructure, and to hook them up at European scale. So there was actually a European database where you could exchange between all the EU countries, except for UK because of Brexit, and Switzerland because the EU had a dispute with Switzerland about some other medical problems, I think the price of medicine or something like this. But more or less, kind of amazing that this design was made in something like 30 days. We had a prototype running in something like 3 to 4 weeks, and then Google and Apple changed their interfaces. Of course, they also played a very important role. And then more or less the first apps were there a month later, beginning of June. And then in Belgium, it took longer because the government took 3 months to decide we wanted this. And then we also got the app running in about 2 months. But I think what it was, in retrospect, amazing that we could show that you can have a privacy-friendly solution. And by the way, if you didn't use a privacy-friendly solution like the Norwegians, then your privacy board or your privacy authority would stop it. That was also clear in Europe. But it was possible to roll this out for about 80 to 100 million users and have it even connected within like 6 to 8 months. So I think it was an amazing success. The effectivity of the app is a different debate because there was not enough support to actually use it. I think there was more in the UK, more in Finland, Ireland, Germany, a bit less in countries like Belgium or the Netherlands. So the pickup was still not enough. And of course, the medical people were very skeptical about it. They felt that it should also be done manually, although it was obvious that there was no way to do the tracing manually given the numbers, right? They still were living in the times of TB when you had a few infections per day. So I don't think it was a major success, but I think it showed that you can get a privacy system rolled out at large scale in a very short time, even if it has some limitations. I think the medical establishment is still skeptical about the impact. I think the best study was done in UK. But I think many impacts are also hard to measure, because we did a study with users, and something they said they really liked is that the app gives me a way to manage my own risk. So I can actually look at things. I take the train to Brussels for my work, and then a day later I get some warnings. Maybe I should not take the train anymore, without actually having to collect centralized information, which is highly sensitive. And also, like this thing was designed, at the moment the end of the pandemic was created, the servers were stopped, the apps were stopped, and all the data was gone. There is actually no surveillance data left, unlike in France and Hungary, where they had a centralized system and the government more or less could figure out who saw whom at every time, which is again information you cannot share with other states. So I think it's a mixed success. So the medical world doesn't see it as success. They say you should have collected much more information. We should have known who was the contact, where it happened. We should have camera. We should have sound. And we told them, well, then people will not use it. It's not going to work. So I think given the constraints, it showed it was possible to roll this out. And I think if there would be a new pandemic, maybe you have better technology and a better support in the health administration, I think it could have been could be very valuable in the future.
Yeah, there's nothing to say that it won't happen again, and I think we see signs of that possibility. So really, we shouldn't dismiss all the learning that we had in that period.
I hope not. I hope we don't get a pandemic, but I hope that we also will
No.
keep our lessons learned. Yes.
Yeah. And so what subjects do you teach, and what areas do you find the most interesting as a teacher?
I teach discrete algebra to second-year students, which I really like to teach, but it seems to be very hard to convince students now in times of ChatGPT and apps and so on to actually learn abstract things. So they always want to see connections. And I try to make the connections to cryptography, to coding, but they seem to still find it too abstract. It's very hard to convince engineering students to do this, but I still find it a fascinating challenge. I teach cryptography network security, which is an introductory course to cryptography and applications. And then I also teach some lectures in advanced cryptography. I do teach a lot also in summer schools all across the planet. This is more related to my more research work, so more advanced talks.
That's good. And what's your opinion on patenting that is in cryptography? It's caused a lot of problems. You find the RSA method was patented, the Diffie-Hellman method, Schnorr signatures and so on. And in some cases, it's really held things back. What's your feelings on whether someone should patent or not?
In some sense, it's unfair, because if you look at other fields, like compressing or coding or spread spectrum, there people take patents and actually everything works fine. They just get fairly compensated for their creative work. In security or cryptography, the view is that first there is many ways to do things, and if we have to pay them, we will not do it, which actually shows security is not important. And so it kind of, if you patent things, you're seen as somebody who stops innovation, while in the telco world or the compression world, this is not seen, or image processing world, is not seen at all like this. So it has some negative image. And of course, then as cryptographer, you also understand that if you do take patents, your stuff may not be used. So this is why many people have abandoned this. The patent system, of course, has also many problems. I'm not saying it's a very good system, but I think in general, I'm in favor of having open systems and having everything freely accessible is definitely also a very good approach. But I think the fact that patenting doesn't work, it does work. For example, in cryptography, it has worked for side channel attacks. There have been people who did quite some patents on countermeasures and so on. And there is implementation side, there is some patenting. I think in general, I'm not against the principle by itself that you get some economic reward for something that contributes to better technology. But the way it has turned out in cryptography, in my view, it's better to not patent too much. So I only have patents when the companies actually insist, and when I work with companies and they insist on doing it, because I don't see much value to society in it, because in our field, people seem to wait until the patent expires or just try to bypass it. But it's very strange that in our field, there seems to be no willingness to reward inventors, while in other fields, this is seen as a very natural thing to do. Having said that, some patent owners, of course, also abuse their power. And there is stories from the RSA patent that indeed it was not so easy to get a license. And the fact that the company was difficult also actually meant that it was hard to set up a business and to use the product. So the patent holder, of course, has to be also flexible enough and has to be willing to encourage innovation.
Yeah. And so what does the next decade look like in cryptography? What do you think the key problems there are to solve?
I think in the research challenge, definitely, of course, there is always the long-term questions, which problems are hard. This is the problem that people are not really paying attention, but I think we should work also on hard problems. But that's not what get the high-profile attention. I think where the real hot topics are is computing and encrypted data. So we have now secured our communications. We have secured stored data. Can we also secure data while it's being processed? And can this help to improve privacy? And I think in general, can we re-architect our IT systems such that they offer more privacy? So we have the whole architecture of everything we have is all in function of price discrimination and selling advertising. And the question is, can we reduce this? Because I'm not sure that this is really what creates value. It creates money in society, but it's great value in society. And it seems that the lesson learned actually destroys some value in society. And it's actually negative, as a negative influence this effect on mass surveillance and collecting information for financial reasons, and of course also for other reasons. So I think we should probably try to go back to square one and redesign an information infrastructure and a digital infrastructure that's much more privacy preserving. And probably the EU can lead there, because we're the first ones to benefit from this, because in the current setup, our data leaves Europe in spite of GDPR. It leaves Europe and is monetized elsewhere. So we actually have an incentive to build more privacy-friendly systems and make sure that, yes, data can be, or systems can be personalized, or you can have recommendation systems, and you can have individualized systems, but at least while protecting individual privacy rights. And I think that's the really big battle. I'm not sure we're going to win it, but at least as researchers, as we did for the contact tracing, it's interesting we can show it can be done. That's the best we can do, and then hope that at some moment the policy world will pick it up.
Yeah. And so if you could change one thing in your career, what would it have been?
Well, I'm very happy in the end with my career choices, although in retrospect, I think I was also lucky that I was told to go into cryptography. At the moment, it was actually beginning to boom and became interesting. I think I got a few times a chance to join a startup or a company, and I created startups, but I never joined myself. Also in the Belgian ecosystem, it's not so easy. And also before I had a job as professor, it would have been very difficult once I would have gone to a company to come back, I think. But I think it would have been nice to have more the US system, where it's easy for a researcher to go to a company and return back to academia. And not really for the money, because if that would have been my drive, I would have done it anyway. But I think it would be interesting to really see this through, to have see how things can really be monetized, and also, of course, come back and have even more freedom, because once you're completely independent, then, of course, I would still do the same thing what I'm doing, with maybe a bit less bureaucracy, or be more efficient and not have to waste some time on a lot of reporting or project management. But if you would have made enough money from industry, you could actually just do the research where you want to have more free time to do that.
And obviously, if you were a new researcher, what problem would you address?
So I think where the big challenges are is getting this privacy architecture working. So there are a lot of questions on privacy systems. Can we build them? Of course, can we architect them? Can we build them? Can we also create a societal environment where these systems actually are adopted and work? So I think, can we redesign our digital world? I think that's a very big question. I think the other very big question is integration of all this technology with our bodies, because it's also clear that sensors will come into our bodies. For now, we start with smartwatches, but the next step will be to implant things and to interact with our brain. I think this is clearly where the challenges will be in the next 20 to 30 years. It's clear we'll have computers built into our bodies, and hopefully then the incentives and infrastructure will be different. Because at least now we have the option to put down our smartphone or put away our smartwatch, but imagine that we have this attention driving systems built into our bodies and we can't switch them off. I think it sounds to me like the ultimate nightmare.
So thank you so much for the chat and for taking some time out of your busy schedule. So just keep up the great work and keep up your great teaching. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Okay, so I just need to stop the recording. This is obviously where it is a bit worrying.